to the Let's Talk Crypto podcast, where we discuss the latest Bitcoin, blockchain, and digital asset news.
Hi everybody, welcome to the 5th episode of Let's Talk Crypto. Today we're going to talk about attacks on the Bitcoin network and how resilient it would be in the face of different types of attacks. To start us off, we're going to talk about attacks from miners. And to get us started, Slava, will miners attack Bitcoin?
Well, let's start by providing our listeners with a definition and function of what miners are and what they do. Miners have an essential role for Bitcoin blockchain as well as most other blockchain. The main function of miners in Bitcoin blockchain is to validate transactions on the network. And that happens in the following way. So new blocks get discovered by miners who continuously solve a puzzle, a mathematical equation to unlock or mine new blocks. Then transactions are added into that block. And the chain is propagated forward. There's a number of different attacks. Since miners play a key role in the ecosystem, there's a number of different types of attacks, both technical and social, that can happen with participation of miners. Typically, I would say, as time moves forward, the probability of a successful attack initiated by miners is decreasing over time. If we're talking about technical attacks, there's nothing relatively new that has been invented related to the blockchain. All of those attacks like denial of service or distributed denial of service do exist in traditional technology when it comes to when we're talking about traditional technology. So just to name a few technical attacks, one of them is denial of service, as I mentioned. You probably all heard about it. It's probably the most famous attack when your email, for example, gets spammed with multitude of requests. Similar thing can happen on the network. Another one is Sybil attack. And Sybil attack is something when you create huge number of fake identities that spam the network. The other one, which is, I would say, a subtype of Sybil attack, but it's more elaborate, is called Ellipse attack. And what it is that you surround the node with malicious nodes. And so good actor is being surrounded by different nodes, and the information that it gets or sends is being filtered by those malicious actors. That could potentially cause problems for the network.
Your comment on the Bitcoin network having existed the longest and the likelihood of a mine attack being successful diminishing with time. Have you ever heard of the Lindy effect?
I have not. Would you share with that?
Okay. Yeah. So the Lindy effect is a theory that the future life expectancy of a non-perishable thing, like a technology, is proportional to its current age. So that every additional period that it survives, it's actually increases its life expectancy. So when you look at something like the Bitcoin network, the Lindy effect is very apparent. Basically, the longer the Bitcoin network has survived, which it has survived the longest out of any of the cryptocurrency networks, it's the oldest, the more likely it is for it to succeed or for its life expectancy to go up. So yeah, go Google that. It's called the Lindy effect. It's very, very interesting.
And that makes absolute sense. When I think of a network, of a Bitcoin blockchain network, I imagine a society made of different actors. The main function of the society is to have a consensus on something. And so if you have a small group of individuals who come together, it's relatively easy to corrupt the decision-making process and therefore create a situation where the network, the community loses its value. However, if you have a large community of people that grows over time and it strengthens its ties together, that makes it more the time and the fact that there's a lot of people participating in the decision-making process makes it more challenging to corrupt the system. And I think what you just described is very logical and kind of mirrors the analogy that I have.
Yes, exactly. You know, the theory, the longer it's been around, the longer its life expectancy will be. And in much the same way you're saying, the less actors involved, the easier it is to corrupt. So the more centralized it is, and the more distributed and more sort of decentralized and bigger the system is, the more actors that need to be corrupted to change the consensus. It makes sense. And in terms of mining, why would a miner in any event attack the network? It's its bread and butter. The failure of the Bitcoin network, or not even the failure, but for a double spend or reorganization of blocks, which we can go into the definition of later, surely would be detrimental to the miner itself. It's sort of like cutting your nose to spite your face.
Yeah, it needs to be clear that when we're talking about miner, maybe we're talking about a single miner, group of miners, but we're not talking about the whole community of miners out there. Because let's take the extreme case where the whole community of miners, at least 51% of the miners decide to become rogue and they attack the network. So that's the well-known 51% attack. So that's the extreme case, of course. But we do have some very I won't say simple attacks, but attacks which do not require a large amount of miners. There are things called Finney attacks. What this means is that a miner can choose to attack a merchant who is accepting Bitcoin as a mode of payment and withhold certain transactions. Okay, so how does it work? Suppose the miner is generating blocks, of course, and what he does is he creates a transaction from an account of his to another account, again, who is under his control, but withholds the propagation of this transaction. Okay, so he has generated a new block, but withholds the propagation to other miners.
Just to be clear, are you saying withholds the block? In other words, he doesn't propagate the block across the network? Or are you saying he doesn't include a transaction in a block?
Correct.
Which one?
No, actually, he includes the transaction in the block, but he withholds the propagation of this block, of this new block.
I got you.
Okay, so what happens is the miner blocks the propagation of that specific block. And the next step is that the miner makes a purchase on a website and uses Bitcoin as a mode of payment. And as soon as he receives confirmation that the purchase has gone through, what he does next is he just releases his own block and propagates it everywhere. And what happens is that his block will probably take precedence over his purchase that he did on the website. So what happens is that he got the product basically for free because the new transaction won't be accepted because of the old block. So this is kinds of attack that can take place. It's not necessarily something that is a flaw in the Bitcoin protocol, but it's based on a feature, on the confirmation feature, that we need to wait a few confirmations just to be sure. But in practical terms, maybe some websites or some merchants might be inclined to not wait for confirmations to make sure that the transactions go very quickly. So these kinds of attacks can be possible via miners.
In other words, you're saying in theory it's possible, but in practice, for small amounts where merchants accept confirmation with very little blocks being confirmed, or release the merchandise early, they could end up being affected. But generally, I think that the amounts would be so small that the effort employed to double spend, as such, for lack of a better word, would not be worth the miner's time. I guess that most merchants that are selling anything of value would require at least a few blocks confirmation before releasing the merchandise or service.
Correct. There's always this compromise between speed and security. Waiting for some confirmation, one or two, is much more secure than not waiting for any action.
Yes, and that's a great example of an attack which could be happening right now and has no effect on the network as a whole. It's not a network breaking or a confidence breaking type of attack. What other types of attacks could a miner do? And I must just say this for the listener, it's not a case of miners are bad and evil and they're out there to attack the Bitcoin network. Not at all. They serve their purpose. They are useful and very much needed by the network. We are just looking at worst case scenarios and what the possibilities are and what can go wrong. So what other types of attacks could they do?
Bitcoin blockchain requires miners to invest substantial amount of energy and resources into validating the blocks, opening and validating the new blocks. They're getting rewarded, but they also have to spend a substantial amount of money to run the operations, the mining operations. And so in order to accomplish the attack, you would have to have a lot of computational power to define the truth for the rest of the network. And so I think when it comes to Bitcoin blockchain, one of the fears is that the mining power is being concentrated in the hands of just three mining pools, major mining pools. And the other fear is that majority, the 50% of miners are located in China. The people are saying that hypothetically, miners can agree to create a disconnect in the network by mining false blocks.
Okay, that makes sense. Is the fear of miners being centralized, as you put it, in China, is it a well-grounded fear, or is it something we should be worried about?
I don't think so. I don't believe that because just because you're in China and you operate a very large mining farm, it does not necessarily mean that you're going to agree with other people to break the system who are located in your vicinity. But what it does bring up another point, which is whether Bitcoin has a proof of work in place or really it is a delegated proof of work, because there's just a number of major mining pools where you can invest your energy, you can connect your computer to that pool, and the pool is going to do work for you in order to open new blocks. And so I do think that Bitcoin network runs on the delegated proof of work rather than proof of work. So I think it's a very subtle but important distinction to make.
In other words, nowadays it's not profitable to run a miner unless you join a mining pool, not like it used to be back in the day. And since those mining pools have got bigger and bigger and the smaller ones have fallen away, could call it a delegated proof of work.
Exactly.
Good point. With miner centralization and the talk of 51% attacks being possible once 51% of the miners collaborate, or pools, or the individuals get together, it enables them to change the consensus rules. Does it or does it not?
I believe that it does, because if you try to see the way the Bitcoin blockchain works and who has the right or the responsibility or even the ability to change the consensus rules, at the end of the day, it is the miners. Because the way it works is that if you want to change something in the Bitcoin protocol, the step is quite, let's say, simple, is that you need to propose a change in what we call BIP, Bitcoin Improvement Proposal. So what it does is just really, if you want to propose a change, you just write a document and upload it online. And this document will be peer reviewed, meaning that the people who are in charge of working on the Bitcoin protocol will review the proposal that you did. And if it does enhance the blockchain, they will include it, they will implement the changes. But at the end of the day, the miners will be the one who will decide whether to include these changes or not. So basically, the miners have the power to change the Bitcoin protocol. Now, the question would also be, why would they need to change the Bitcoin protocol or Bitcoin blockchain? It should be something which would be in their advantage. But if they create a system, or not a system, a situation where they are dividing the network, in the end, this would be, I believe, detrimental to all of them. It's based on the game theory. Like if everyone has a good behavior, everyone wins. Or if a few have a bad behavior, then everyone loses. So the economics of it makes it that creating attacks on the network will ultimately mean everyone is losing.
I mean, this has all got to do with game theory here, but Bitcoin miners, they made alterations to the then current Bitcoin consensus and protocol, right? The reason that it was able to split is because miners still continued mining the original consensus protocol. In terms of miners being able to change the rules, perhaps even something as sensitive as the 21 million coin limit can be held to account by the users, by the nodes. So if people are running full nodes and the miners decide to change it to 42 million coins and they change their software and they start rejecting blocks that are conform to the 21 million coin limit, then there will be a split. Therefore, they may have the mining capacity to carry on, but they might not have any users on their chain.
I think we can look at the history which happened a year and a half ago. If we look at the fork when Bitcoin split and Bitcoin Cash was born, it's a very similar concept, but I don't think we can use the terminology of an attack, because what happened is that there is a group of miners that agreed to a different set of rules as far as what Bitcoin blockchain should be. And so they forked Bitcoin and changed the parameters in code to increase the size of the block. However, they didn't start from the beginning. The fork happened in real time. So it is a very similar concept where something what Suyash was saying is that if a group of people agree on a different set of rules, you can make changes. So in that specific event, a new blockchain was created out of Bitcoin blockchain. If we're talking about a fork, so not only you have to agree on what the change is, but you also have to make sure that the public follows you, because you would not want to continuously spend resources on mining when there's no users on the network. We've seen that in 2018 when a lot of, I believe something like around 10 Bitcoin forks were created, something like Bitcoin Diamond, Bitcoin Gold, even more, and most of them are dead because users did not follow. There's not enough social support for the fork. When we're talking about Bitcoin blockchain, I think one of the criticism that a lot of critics put forward is that it consumes a lot of energy. We just have talked about that the aspect of mining requires a lot of energy to validate the blocks and to ensure that everyone agrees on one version of reality. However, do you see a potential downfall of Bitcoin blockchain requiring a lot of energy?
The aspect of social infiltration, yes, I do. I think that they could change the minds of people that support Bitcoin and push them onto other consensus mechanisms with the belief that the Bitcoin network is consuming too much energy and is detrimental for the planet. I firmly believe that the Bitcoin network is actually very environmentally friendly. It's hard for me to argue that point. I believe that the way that the Chinese and now in Canada, miners have started using renewable energy, especially energy that disappears if it's not used. For example, let's say a hydroelectric plant where the water is turning the turbines and the capacity is not being used. The miners are now buying that spare capacity from local counties and jurisdictions and municipalities, even at a discounted rate, whereas the money would have gone nowhere and they would have the energy would have been expended into nothing. Now it's being used to support the Bitcoin network. I think it brings a high level of efficiency to the whole system. And I think just by that mere fact, it could be seen as environmentally friendly. And if you compare the consumption of the Bitcoin network in terms of energy to the legacy system, it's laughable. It's not even a blip on the radar. If you think about banks, all their infrastructure, their buildings, their resources, all the electricity and all their branches, all their computer systems, their server farms, the energy that's expended for the employees to get to work and get back home, the networks, everything. Bitcoin, I don't even think would come up to 1% of what the banks consume around the world. Never mind the third parties attached to the banks and the intermediaries associated with them.
Wes, I think this is a great point. I've never thought about this way. Yes, we hear a lot that Bitcoin network consumes a lot of energy, and quite often the amount of energy it consumes is juxtaposed to some smaller countries. But it is definitely true that if we compare the amount of energy Bitcoin consumes with the legacy system, it most likely is going to be just a fraction of what banks and related activities that you just described consume in terms of the energy.
That's correct. They're very quick to show what it consumes, but not very quick to show what energy it's actually saving.
It's a great point.
And giving the net consumption afterwards. Okay, on different types of attacks with miners, they can reorganize the blocks, they can do double spending, and they could also mess with the consensus and create forks, and with that there's a whole bunch of social attacks that they could launch. Let's move on though to governments. Governments is a big one. Bitcoin is basically, if you think about it, a direct attack on governments and their ability to print money. What do you see as some of the more immediate feasible attacks that governments may take or have already taken against Bitcoin?
I think there are two general approaches to the situation where governments might feel threatened by an alternative to the financial system. The first one is to ban it. We've seen it happen in many countries. The majority, quite famously, China has outlawed a lot of blockchain cryptocurrency projects. So a lot of exchanges that were located in China have moved elsewhere. The other approach from the government, which I think is more interesting, is to mimic the system. So if we look at Venezuela has created a Petra coin, which is a digital asset linked to the price of oil. I don't believe that was very successful or is very successful, but nevertheless, I think it's one of the ways to deal with a potential threat from the government's perspective when it comes to Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. If you can't break it, then just fake it.
Yes, if you can't beat them, join them. I think that would be a type of social attack too by the government, where they are creating sort of an equivalent, but not an equivalent, I don't want to use that word, but creating confusion, which one is more legitimate. The one that's backed by the government, which is what all people are used to, are sort of, I don't want to say brainwashed, but they're used to everything must be backed and insured by the government. So I think that would be an interesting attack without it being hidden. And they came out and they said, this is our cryptocurrency. We give it our full backing as the US government, for example. It would be interesting to see what effect that would have. I tend to think that there would be some out there that would probably prefer to use that than Bitcoin at present.
And I think that the other ways that government can use its power to like repress Bitcoin or the cryptocurrencies is through the use of regulations. Actually, they have been doing this for decades. It's not different now with the emergence of cryptocurrencies. But the interesting part is that government can quite easily, if you take the case of Bitcoin, can quite easily track Bitcoin transactions because it's a public ledger. And they can easily link any transaction, any history of transactions to a specific user when that user is going to convert his Bitcoin to fiat. So that's one avenue of where governments can repress the use of crypto by regulations. But on the other hand, what happens is that when these things happen, the technology quite literally takes over. For example, tracking transactions on Bitcoin is, yes, easy, but now we are seeing new technology like zero proof of knowledge, which can be added as an additional layer on Bitcoin or is inherently active in other cryptocurrencies, which makes it that you do a transaction, everybody sees that there's a transaction, but you don't know where it's coming from, where it's going, or even the amount. So what's happening right now is the governments are trying to regulate everything. The pace of the technology is making sure that they are just trying to catch up with what is happening. So basically, there's always this race going on, and I believe that the governments, because of their lack of knowledge, which is actually a bad thing because they need to know about all the technological stuff and things like that, but they will be lagging behind for the foreseeable future.
Yes. And I mean, it's a technological sort of attack on Bitcoin, and it's probably not the wisest thing to do as a government is to attack a technical community. They're probably going to iterate and adjust, pivot, and come back stronger.
Correct, yeah.
Another technical attack could be to censor transactions. By monitoring packets of data, they could find the signatures which make up a Bitcoin transaction and filter them out. And I like to use the example of China with the Great Firewall of China, as they call it, where they have this sort of internet which is monitored by the big daddy state, and its population is only allowed to see what it approves. Now, much in the same way, governments will likely try and sniff out, for lack of a better word, Bitcoin transactions and censor them. But on the other hand, there are other ways of transmitting transactions nowadays, if forced to, and if it's an emergency situation. We've got the satellite broadcasting via Blockstream. There are alternative ways of doing things. You can connect modems. Important nodes could be connected modem to modem. And I'm sure there's other techniques to get around certain ISPs and certain countries that are sort of filtering information in and out of their territory. Besides technological attacks, government would likely attack the Bitcoin network or the Bitcoin community much in the same way that it attacks other grassroots movements, by infiltrating, sowing dissent, disagreement, spreading propaganda, doubt, paying shills and sock puppets to spread false information, and generally divide and conquer. Now, it's arguable whether we've seen that already in the Bitcoin community and the Bitcoin network, and whether that is actually taking place at the moment. But if you think about it, it's definitely a viable way of attacking something which is so resilient. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
It's true. I mean, from a technological perspective, it's true that the governments or the big corporations are maybe behind, but they do have other avenues, like you mentioned, Wes, that they could attack crypto communities or crypto ecosystems. And this way, it's sometimes very, very effective, like when you put doubt and fear in people's mind about the use of cryptocurrencies, their safety, security issues, and the well-known energy consumption propaganda that has been going on for a while. So these things do have an effect on people, and I personally have witnessed that. I usually do some talks in Mauritius here and talk about blockchain and cryptocurrencies, and I hear a lot of people expressing a lot of doubts about the Bitcoin protocol, about fears of losing the funds, fears that other people, government agencies have put in their mind, like financial regulators in Mauritius and so on. So these things are real, and to assure you, as these things are currently happening. On the other hand, I think that it is the role of people in the technological sector to try to educate people about the real things behind these technologies.
I can relate to that. I can relate to that. Over the last 3 years, I've been working in smaller companies. And so part of my set of responsibilities was always to find and build teams, recruit people. And so obviously the sector which I was working in and working in now, is blockchain and cryptocurrencies. And I've talked to many good friends who are in technology about potentially joining forces and working on products together. However, I did see whether explicit or implicit fear of entering the industry, because it's highly volatile in terms of regulatory framework as well as other factors. But
you see, Slava, right there, what you are saying about regulation sowing doubt, and people maybe perhaps not even having the confidence to enter the industry, sowing the seeds of doubt in terms of regulation. So if you look at what's happening right now, nobody really knows where cryptocurrency stands 100%, if I can put it that way. And I talk mainly about the US. It's sort of left in a slightly gray area. And I do believe that it's not just a wait and see approach. I do believe that does create a bit of uncertainty. There's a lot of people, companies, and large companies and institutions that will not embrace it until there's legal clarity and regulations in place that they understand, and it's no longer in a gray area. Sorry, I interrupted. Continue.
I did want to pose a different side of the story, tell a different side of the story. We did see many examples where a technology, which initially created by government, but then the government would let the technology grow and flourish by itself with the support of the community. So an obvious example is the internet. It was born during the Cold War in the United States and the Soviet Union, and was created as an effective defense mechanism against potentially nuclear strike from the Soviet Union. However, we all use internet right now, and we cannot say that it belongs to a particular government organization or group of people. Another example is GPS navigation. I believe it was initially developed by the United States government, but then the access to the technology became free of charge to the end user, at least.
Absolutely. Look, I'm only playing devil's advocate there. If government doesn't only have to attack Bitcoin, government could also embrace Bitcoin. And I do believe that would have a much more positive impact. And there's a lot of people out there that think government won't exist for Bitcoin to succeed. And I'm not one of those people. I do believe they can coexist. And I do believe that eventually we'll reach a point where Bitcoin is embraced more so than it's binary, one or the other. That being said, there are examples right now, the US not being one of them, of other countries out there who are innovating and taking the lead with cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin.
Absolutely, absolutely. So one of those countries is Switzerland. It is perfectly situated to support the technological development, and especially when it comes to the financial sector. So over the last year and a half, what we've seen is that a lot of ICOs, companies that raise money, funds through an ICO, establish a legal presence in Zug, Switzerland. And that just drives growth for the region and the country specifically. Another example that I like to share is Uzbekistan, where I'm originally from. Probably around a year and a half, I organized the first international blockchain meetup. And one of the things I talked about is that Uzbekistan can have, as a developing country, it can have a potential to create a growth driver for the economy if it embraces blockchain and Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. So I'm really glad to see that this is happening. Cryptocurrency has gained a legal status, which is different from securities. Also, the government is open to jumpstarting an exchange, cryptocurrency exchange, which will be located here in Uzbekistan. And so we do see interest from international investors to potentially relocating here from regions which are more strict in terms of regulations and cryptocurrency.
And what I want to add also is that currently the situation is a bit like this. Smaller countries, like they want to compete with the bigger countries, but maybe they don't have the resources, they don't have the natural resources or the human resources to do that. And technology, more specifically blockchain and cryptocurrencies, do provide a way to innovate more rapidly and more flexibly than other bigger countries. And this is what is happening actually in Mauritius. Like the Mauritian government, yes, they do have a lot of apprehension concerning blockchain and cryptocurrencies, but they also see the opportunity of a new kind of economy, a new kind of business, a new kind of sector. And they're trying to push forward with new regulations, new licenses, and encourage the blockchain community to come up with innovative solutions. So although there's the bad side, but I believe that governments all around the world, especially smaller countries, are seeing the huge opportunity that this technology might be bringing in the near future. And this is a very good thing, actually.
And the question then comes is, what will be the rate of acceptance? Because we generally think about governments as something big organizations that move slowly for a number of reasons. And if we look at Bitcoin, blockchain, and other cryptocurrencies, it's a community-driven, as Wes said, it's a grassroots movement that is growing really rapidly in terms of technological development. And so I think there is a natural process of governments or parts of governments trying to retain the power and at the same time looking for ways to potentially embrace the technology. But the matter of fact is that the technology develops much faster than the regulatory framework. I hope, my personal wish is that global economy and large countries and large economies would embrace and regulate cryptocurrencies and blockchain in a way that it allows for the innovation to flourish.
Very well put indeed. I think that as you get maybe even before the smaller nations, you get some of the rogue nations who are trying to circumvent the legacy systems. Perhaps they're trying to circumvent sanctions or some form of censorship. They start using it. Then you'll find the smaller countries like the Switzerland or the Mauritius or the Malta start embracing it. Then the bigger countries start looking at it, and so it's almost like a social pressure on country level where, eventually the tipping point is reached and you're either one of the pioneers or you're one of the last to join. And I think that's the stage where, you will get global adoption.
Do you think, when is the tipping point? Do you think we're far away from when it starts gaining and other cryptocurrencies start gaining mass adoption? And how far is that tipping point? Because I don't believe we're still there.
I think we're still very early days in terms of adoption. I don't think that, as some people put it, it's going to be within the next 2 to 3 years. I'm looking at 5 to 10 years before where we can genuinely say we can't really remember transacting before cryptocurrencies. And when I say that, I don't say that there won't be any fiat or any sort of government-backed money or any sort of legacy systems at all. I just think that cryptocurrencies will play a much bigger role and be on the same level, at least the same level as transaction volume globally as what the legacy systems are, if not much more. Full adoption doesn't require the death of every other type of payment method or transaction or money, as far as I believe.
And I do remember that once Wes put that in a very concrete way. He told me that, look, in about 5 years, everyone will have 2 accounts, a bank account and a crypto wallet. And this is how they are going to do transactions. And yeah, I think that in the next 5 to 10 years, this is where the real large-scale adoption will start taking place. The regulations will fall into place. There will be large-scale adoption from merchants and then from users. And I think that, yes, the next 5 years will be very, very important and very interesting.
Back to attacks. Quantum computing. It's another item that gets brought up a lot. When I'm talking to people about Bitcoin initially, a lot of them that have done a bit of reading up on it immediately jump to the energy problem, and then afterwards they go to the quantum computing, saying that the cryptography behind Bitcoin will be cracked. It's only a matter of time. Quantum computing is around the corner, and the NSA, for example, the CIA, will render it useless once they've got their quantum computers. Is that something that we should be worried about?
I think that quantum computing does pose a certain danger to the whole Bitcoin blockchain, principally because the Bitcoin blockchain is actually the other blockchains also is based on the public-private cryptography system, and this system is particularly vulnerable to quantum computing. That said, it doesn't mean that there are no ways around that. Currently, ways that could be used to avoid any quantum computing attacks, but the thing is that there is no real reason to apply that now, because it would mean compromising on other things like scalability, adding a lot more data on blocks, and which would create other kinds of problems. So I think that what will happen is when this will become a reality, that is quantum computing will become a reality and will pose a danger to Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, there will be ways to counter these attack medium, and there are actually people working on this. I won't go into the technicals, but there are new versions of public-private key cryptography that is much more resilient to quantum computing. So solutions do exist, but are currently not practical to be implemented.
Or should, as you put it, not a priority right now.
Correct. Definitely not a priority right now.
I would like to add that quantum computing is in very early stages of development. If you Google and look at these videos that show commercial setups with quantum computers, they look something like regular computers looked 40, 50 years ago. They're huge, they're massive, they require a lot of costs to maintain the technology. Just like Suyash was saying a moment earlier, there are always ways to make cryptography stronger to address the issue of quantum computing. But I definitely agree with you, Suyash, that this is not a priority because we have, as a movement, we have much more important tasks at hand at this point in time.
In closing thoughts on the topic of Bitcoin being attacked, is there much for the new users joining the network, joining the community to worry about? Or are their fears best placed elsewhere?
I think when we're talking about innovative and disruptive technologies, friction is inevitable. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are addressing the need to have a more sustainable financial services. And just by its nature, the amount of friction that's going to be produced and energy that's going to be produced during the adoption process is going to be substantially larger than if we are comparing it to other innovative and disruptive technology.
In the early stages of adoption, there will be a lot of friction caused by the incumbents not being happy with the new technology or the new way of doing things. The incumbents being, like you mentioned, the horse and buggy people not being happy that cars have been invented, or the telephone people saying that you're going to get cancer from cell phones, or, that type of thing. I think that new users best invest their time in learning more about the technology, learning more about economics and how money and finances work currently and have been working for the last 100 years, and especially for the last 50 years on the fiat system. Learning more about game theory and how that is employed within the Bitcoin ecosystem between miners, users, nodes, economic actors, exchanges, rather than concentrating on what attacks are possible. Even though it is the natural thing to do when you're learning about a technology is to find out how will it break. I think due to the Lindy effect and the fact that Bitcoin has been around for so long now, I think it could almost be taken for granted that it is stable and that time would be best spent in learning more how to use it and how to add value to the system. And your thoughts, Suyash, closing thoughts?
The way I see it is that Bitcoin has been around for quite some years now. And I do believe that it has been under attack every single day. And until now, it hasn't been subject to very kind of important attack. Actually, it has become more robust and more stable. And this gives credence to the fact that the technological development is going in a good direction. And let's assume that for a minute, tomorrow a very important flaw is discovered in the Bitcoin blockchain and people are able to hack the Bitcoin blockchain or anything similar to that. What will happen is, after this initial discovery, a new version of all this ecosystem will emerge with better security, with a new committee and so on. So this movement will always be evolving and will always become stronger and more stable and more robust.
Well put. I think as Andreas Antonopoulos put it, this omelette cannot be turned back into eggs.